Alright, so we got squash and stretch, and we got easing. Now the next thing we're going to be doing is just applying some gravity to this, because this ball would not bounce the same height every single time. Eventually it's going to start to get lower and lower. It'll start to speed up, and it'll have less squash and stretch as it goes along. So we're going to adjust all three of those. So this is going to be kind of a lot that we need to do with this. But there's a couple tricks that we can use to make this a little bit easier on ourselves. So first, let's select the layer so we can see squash and stretch. You can see the path and everything this is taking. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is we'll lower the height of each one of these bounces. So it gets lower and lower each time. And once we get that working, we'll work on the width, and then we'll adjust the speed and the amount of squash and stretch. So the key thing here is just coming up with a formula for yourself. And if you're working from an actual ball, you want to actually figure out how much that ball bounces each time, whether it goes down to half the bounce or a third of the bounce or 2/3 of the bounce if it's a very elastic ball. But you'll just need to make some observations on your own to see how that ball would bounce. For what we're doing, we're just kind of making up a fictitious ball. So we're going to be doing 2/3 about for each height. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take each one of these and kind of lower it down. So I could go into each keyframe and then physically lower my ball down each time, but that's a little tedious. So similar to what we did before when we had to adjust the anchor point for the ball, we're going to adjust the height of each of these by dragging them on the stage rather than dragging the ball itself. So we'll leave our first one where it's supposed to be. That's going to be the initial drop height. And then we'll move on to our second one, and you could just physically click and drag it down and measure it out to be what you kind of guess to be about 2/3 of the height of the previous bounce. Move on to the next one. Same thing. Try to guesstimate about 2/3 of the height. Following one. And you're just going to keep doing this until you reach the end. Sorry, when I'm doing this, I have a magic mouse, and if I accidentally scroll, it zooms in and out a lot, which, once you get used to it, is really helpful if you need to zoom in and out. You won't have to hit Command plus or Command minus, but sometimes it does it on its own when you don't mean it to, because you just kind of naturally move your finger up and down on the mouse. Okay, so this looks pretty good. This one maybe could be a tiny bit lower, and we might need to adjust this again once we do the widths, because it's a little hard to tell at this point. Basically, it should be making a pretty straight line through here, but we have different widths, so it's a little hard to judge it right now. Now, once you got the height working, you do a very similar thing for the width, and you just want to think of it as each bounce is going to be a smaller version of the previous bounce. So you can see, obviously, these later ones just look a little bit wider than the previous ones. So once again, we always want to start with the one that's closest to the original bounce. If you want to keep yourself from adjusting the height while you're adjusting the width by dragging it back and forth, once you start dragging, you can hold down the Shift key, and that'll lock it to just one dimension, either X or Y. And you just want to make a smaller version of each bounce. Now, when we get done with this, it might mean that we have to add a few extra bounces in, because it might just kind of stop on the screen. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I can see my last contact position, which is a wee bit too low. That looks pretty good. And if it's not perfect, it's going to be really hard to tell, as long as it's really close. All right, so we got our height and width. You can tell it looks a little weird at the end, especially because it really starts to slow down. And that's because it's taking the same amount of time for each bounce, even though this is a much smaller bounce than this bounce. So what we have to do now is we have to actually adjust the timing of it. Now there's a little bit of a trick to this, and the motion guide will help us out with this. What we want to do is we want to match the number of dots on the previous bounce to the bounce we're adjusting. So for instance, we'll start by adjusting this one first, this first bounce, based off the initial drop. Okay. And I can see the initial drop has about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then one down here. So about 6 dots along it. And this one should have about 9 or 10 because that's how many frames are in between each one. I think it's 9. So we're going to have to lower the amount to make sure that we kind of match where the dots are on each side. Now to do this, there's a little bit of a trick that allows you to squash time in After Effects. And it takes some getting used to, and it has a couple drawbacks to it as well, but it can also be a big lifesaver in a situation like this. So we're going to be selecting all the keyframes from this first bounce, first contact position forward, which is going to be frame 10 here. So what you want to do is you can either shift select or you can draw a bounding box to select all these keyframes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to squash them all in time until the number of dots on this side aligns with the number of dots at the same height on this side. Let me move my playhead so my ball is not blocking my view. So to do this, what you want to do is you want to hold down the Option key, which should be to the left of your Command key, or to the right if you're working on the right side of the keyboard. It'll say Alt Option, and if you're working in a PC-based or Windows-based PC, it'll just say Alt. Okay. So you're going to hold that key down, and you're going to grab the last selected keyframe, and you're just going to drag it back, and you'll see them squashing together. And while you're doing this, you want to keep an eye. You can ignore all the lower bounces. You do want them to shrink with this, so you don't have to shrink as much later. But what you want to do is you want to keep an eye on the relationship between this side and this side, so that both sides have a pretty equal number of dots. And something else you should try to do is try to get it so that you have a dot in the center here, or at least you have an even number on both sides. This is almost there. This is going to save you some trouble later, and I'll explain why when we get to it. Okay, as close as possible as I can get to it. All right. So we can see now. See, one. Can match these up, match these up, match these up. There we go. There we go. And they're not going to be at the exact right height, but as long as they're about the same number, it should be great. Actually, I think I'm going to go just a little bit more so that this one ends up at the top. There we go. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect. Okay. Like I said, this one's a little bit higher. These ones are a little bit higher, but then they get a little bit closer together there. And that's because we have that easing on it. It's fine. That's exactly what we want. Okay. Now, we didn't bother to line these up because, of course, these are going to have to be re-squashed again. Okay. Now, we're going to need to do it for the next bounce. But before we do that, when you do squash it in this sort of way, it can cause your frames to actually float in between it can cause your keyframes to float in between where two frames are. If you look down on my timeline here, this is a good example of it. So this is on, my playhead's on frame 21 here, and then frame 22 here. But you'll see that neither time does this keyframe actually line up with it. It's always in between those two. So it's actually floating in between there. So it's on like frame 21.5. Now, this is only an issue for areas where your objects are going to be making contact with things. So for instance, right here, if this keyframe were floating in between two frames, it would look like the ball never actually hit the ground. And if that happens, you can actually just physically drag the keyframe either forward or backwards, and it'll snap into place for you to fix that. But for frames that kind of fall in between, frames, keyframes that are kind of going up or going down and not ending in a specific spot, it's not too big of a deal. It's more of an issue when it's like hitting the ground or pressing against the wall or something like that. That way you can actually see it hit the ground or press against the wall. Otherwise, it's going to look like it never actually makes contact. But by putting that other frame right there in the top center, that kind of fixed that issue for us. If we hadn't done that, we would probably have to adjust this bottom keyframe for this next contact position. Okay. So we've got our first bounce done. Now we're going to have to do the exact same thing on our next bounce, which is going to be wherever your next bounce is. Mine's at frame 22, forward. So once again, you're going to be selecting every one of the frames from there forward. And this time we're going to be aligning this side with this side. So we can see that this side here has about 1, 2, 3, we'll say 4. We'll count this one as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4 frames. And this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's probably a 6th one up here. So it's a little bit too much time still. So once again, we're going to do the same thing, grabbing from the end, holding down the Option key, Alt if you're on Windows, and pushing in 1, 2, 3, and put that 4th one at the top. Right. And this one actually does line up really well. It's just the top one that's a little bit off, but that looks good. Once again, since we did put a frame at the top here, that tends to put a frame at the bottom here too. If you do notice that your ball doesn't look like it's hitting the ground, like I said, it's a good idea to shift it a little bit, at least on the position and the scale, right where the contact is. And then we just keep doing this over and over again. This time on this keyframe. So everything from here forward. Move you out of the way. This time we have about 1, 2, we'll say 3 on this one. Squash it together. So it's 1, 2, 3. So 2 on the way up and then 1 in the center. And then our last bounce, we just need, we'll do 2. We'll do 1 in the center and then we'll do 1 at the top on each side. So just grabbing these last ones. And these ones you don't actually have to squash since, it's basically just 3 keyframes. You can just physically drag them closer together. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Sorry. You do have to squash it because we want to get all of these ones. We'll squash all these together so that we have 1 on each side and we have 1 at the top here. There we go. Okay. You can see how it speeds up as each bounce kind of lowers. And you may need to add another bounce. I would probably do another bounce on mine, and I'll just go forward 1 frame, go up a tiny bit, go forward another frame, go down. And then what I like to do once I get that last tiny bounce in, that 1 frame bounce, is I'll just move forward a few frames and just slide it right off the side of the stage, because then it would roll after that typically, because it has the inertia from moving forward anyway. Right. So obviously it wouldn't squash this much from now on. So now we're going to have to make some adjustments to the way the squash happens as well. So these ones are fine because those are the initial ones that we set up, but we're just going to be lowering the amount from now on. So we'll start with this frame, This is our second contact position, or right before our second contact position. Instead of having 80, 120, maybe we do 90, 110. And then when it makes contact, we'll do 115 and 85. And then 90, 110 for the next one going up. Turns to 100, 100. This one we'll do 95, 105. And 110, 90. And I'm just kind of guessing on these. And this was going to also be 95, 105. So if this doesn't look right when you do it, you can always change the way it's done a little bit. And then, once it gets to this point, I'm just going to get rid of all my stretches. So I type you in as 100, 100. And I'll do one last squash at 105, 95. I'll get rid of this stretch so that it will return to 100%. And then I'll get rid of these last two keyframes where it squashes and stretches again. So basically just lowering the amount each time. Until it looks like it no longer gets affected by the bounces. Okay. So we did a lot. We lowered the height of each bounce. We lowered the width of each bounce. We lowered the speed of each bounce. And then we changed lowered the amount of squash and stretch for each bounce.